What would you do if you found a 400-pound black bear lying motionless on the side of a mountain road, barely clinging to life? Most people would keep driving. Most people would call the authorities and hope for the best. But Jake Morrison isn't most people. And what happened next? Well, it's a story that will restore your faith in the incredible bond between humans and the wild creatures we share this planet with. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. It was a crisp October morning in the mountains of British Columbia when Jake Morrison's life changed forever. Jake, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer, was driving through the winding roads of Whistler National Park, chasing the perfect shot of autumn foliage bathed in golden morning light. The mist was still clinging to the treetops, and the air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe. But as Jake rounded a sharp curve near mile marker 47, something made him slam on his brakes. There, sprawled across the yellow center line like a dark shadow against the asphalt, was a massive black bear. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he pulled over, his photographer's instincts warring with common sense. "Stay in the truck," he whispered to himself, hands trembling on the steering wheel. But something about the way the bear lay there, so still, so vulnerable, made Jake grab his camera and step out into the morning air. As he approached cautiously, Jake could see the bear's chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. This wasn't an aggressive animal. This was a creature in desperate need of help. The bear's fur was matted with blood, and Jake could see the telltale marks of a vehicle strike along its side. Someone had hit this magnificent animal and left it to die. Jake Morrison hadn't always been a wildlife photographer. 5 years earlier, he'd been just another corporate lawyer in Vancouver, spending his days in glass towers and his nights wondering if there was more to life than billable hours and client meetings. It was actually an encounter with a family of black bears near his childhood cabin one evening that changed everything. He'd been sitting on his deck one evening, nursing a coffee and contemplating yet another soul-crushing day at the firm, when a mother bear and her 2 cubs wandered into his backyard. Instead of fear, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pure wonder. The way the cubs tumbled over each other, the gentle patience of their mother, the raw authenticity of their existence. It awakened something in Jake that had been dormant for far too long. That night, he dusted off his old camera and spent hours photographing the bear family. When he developed those photos, he knew his life had to change. Within 6 months, he'd left his law practice, sold his condo, and dedicated himself to capturing the untold stories of wildlife in the Canadian wilderness. But standing there, on that mountain road, looking down at a dying bear, Jake realized that sometimes the camera isn't enough. Sometimes you have to put it down and act. Jake knew he was taking an enormous risk. Even injured, a black bear could easily kill a human with one swipe of its massive paw. But as he knelt beside the animal, he could see something in its eyes. Not aggression, but a plea for help that transcended species. "Easy, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the mountain wind. "I'm going to help you." The bear's breathing was getting shallower. Jake could see that internal injuries were taking their toll, and time was running out fast. He fumbled for his phone, but of course there was no cell service this deep in the mountains. The nearest ranger station was 40 miles away, and Jake knew the bear wouldn't survive the wait for professional help to arrive. That's when Jake made a decision that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. He was going to load this 400-pound wild animal into his pickup truck and drive it to safety himself. Now, If you've never tried to move an unconscious bear, let me tell you, it's not exactly covered in most first aid manuals. Jake spent the next 20 minutes using fallen branches as makeshift levers and his truck's winch system to carefully, painstakingly load the bear into his truck bed. Every few minutes, he'd stop to check if the animal was still breathing, his heart breaking a little more each time he saw those labored, shallow breaths. The drive down the mountain was the longest 40 miles of Jake's life. He drove with his hazard lights flashing, one eye on the road and one on his rearview mirror, watching for any sign that the bear was stirring. With every bump in the road, he worried he was causing more damage. With every curve, he feared he was too late. Dr. Sarah Chen had been the lead veterinarian at the Whistler Wildlife Rehabilitation Center for 8 years, but she'd never had someone show up at her facility with a critically injured black bear in the back of their pickup truck. "Are you completely insane?" she asked Jake as they worked together to transfer the bear to an examination table. "Probably," Jake admitted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "But I couldn't just leave him there." What Dr. Chen discovered during her examination was both heartbreaking and miraculous. The bear had indeed been struck by a vehicle, likely a large truck based on the impact pattern. He had 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a severe concussion. By all rights, he should have died on that mountain road. But here's where the story takes its first incredible turn. As Dr. Chen worked to stabilize the bear, something remarkable happened. Despite being under anesthesia, despite his critical injuries, the bear seemed to respond to Jake's presence. When Jake spoke softly and placed his hand near the animal's head, the bear's vital signs actually improved. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Chen murmured, checking her monitors for the 3rd time. "It's like he knows you're here to help." The bear, whom Jake had started calling Mountain because of where they'd met, wasn't out of the woods yet. The next 72 hours were critical. Internal bleeding from damaged organs could still prove fatal, and there was significant concern about brain swelling from the concussion. Jake never left the facility. For 3 days and 3 nights, he slept on a cot next to Mountain's enclosure, talking to the unconscious bear about everything and nothing. He told Mountain about his old life as a lawyer, about the bear family that had changed his perspective, about the sunrise he'd been trying to photograph that morning when he found him. "You know, Joey," Jake whispered on the 2nd night, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, "everyone thinks I saved you, but I think maybe you saved me too." Dr. Chen found herself documenting behavior she'd never seen before in her years of wildlife rehabilitation. Mountain's recovery was progressing faster than anyone had dared to hope, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's constant presence was playing a role. On the 3rd day, Mountain opened his eyes for the first time since the accident. Now, what happened next is something that still gives Dr. Chen chills when she talks about it. As Mountain's eyes focused and awareness returned, he did something that defied everything experts know about wild bear behavior. He looked directly at Jake and made a soft huffing sound, a vocalization that bear researchers recognize as a sign of acknowledgement and, in some cases, affection. "Jake," Dr. Chen whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "He's trying to communicate with you." Over the following weeks, as Mountain's physical strength returned, something unprecedented began to happen. Despite being a wild animal, despite having every reason to fear humans after being struck by a vehicle, Mountain began to display what could only be described as gratitude toward his rescuer. When Jake would arrive at the rehabilitation center each morning, Mountain would immediately move to the side of his enclosure closest to Jake. When Jake spoke, Mountain would respond with gentle huffs and what Dr. Chen swore looked like attempts to nod. Most remarkably, when it came time for medical procedures that clearly frightened the bear, Mountain would visibly calm down when Jake was present. In 20 years of wildlife rehabilitation, Dr. Chen later told reporters, I've never seen a bond like this form between a human and a wild animal. It challenges everything we think we know about the emotional capacity of bears. But the most incredible moment was yet to come. 6 weeks after the accident, Mountain had made a full recovery. His ribs had healed, the internal bleeding had stopped, and the neurological damage from his concussion had completely resolved. It was time to release him back into the wild. The plan was simple. They would transport Mountain to a remote area of the park, far from roads and human activity, and give him his freedom back. Jake knew this day was coming, had been preparing for it, but that didn't make it any easier. On the morning of the release, Jake arrived at the center to find Mountain pacing restlessly in his enclosure. Dr. Chen met Jake at the entrance with tears already in her eyes. He knows, she said simply. Somehow, he knows today is different. The transport to the release site took 2 hours. Mountain rode calmly in the specially designed transport crate, but Jake noticed the bear's eyes never left him during the entire journey. It was as if Mountain was trying to memorize every detail of the human who had saved his life. When they arrived at the release site, a pristine meadow surrounded by dense forest, Jake's hands were shaking as he helped Dr. Chen prepare to open the transport crate. This was it. This was goodbye. Ready? Dr. Chen asked, her hand on the release mechanism. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. The crate door swung open and Mountain stepped out into the meadow. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, breathing in the scent of freedom, his massive frame silhouetted against the forest beyond. And then something happened that no one was prepared for. Instead of immediately heading for the safety of the trees, Mountain turned around and walked directly to Jake. Dr. Chen held her breath, her hand moving instinctively toward the tranquilizer gun, but Jake held up a hand to stop her. Mountain stopped less than 3 feet from Jake and sat down, something adult black bears rarely do in the presence of humans. For a long moment, bear and man simply looked at each other, and Jake swears he could see recognition, gratitude, and yes, love in Mountain's dark eyes. Then Mountain did something that brought everyone present to tears. He reached out with one massive paw and gently touched Jake's hand. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Then Mountain huffed once more, turned, and walked calmly into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if he'd never been away. Jake thought that was the end of their story. He was wrong. 3 months later, Jake was back in the same area of the park photographing a family of deer near a mountain stream. He was so focused on getting the perfect shot that he didn't notice the rustling in the bushes behind him until it was too late. When Jake turned around, his heart nearly stopped. There, not 10 feet away, stood Mountain. Jake's first instinct was fear. This was a wild bear now, fully recovered and back in his natural habitat. But as their eyes met, Jake saw the same recognition he'd witnessed during the release. Mountain huffed softly, the same greeting sound he'd made in the rehabilitation center. For the next hour, Mountain simply stayed. He didn't approach Jake, didn't try to interact, just remained nearby as Jake continued photographing the wildlife. It was as if Mountain was returning the favor, standing guard while Jake worked, protecting the human who had once protected him. When Jake finally packed up his equipment and started back toward his truck, Mountain followed at a respectful distance. Only when Jake was safely at his vehicle did Mountain disappear back into the forest. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Over the next 2 years, Mountain appeared to Jake more than a dozen times during his photography expeditions in the area. Never threatening, never intrusive, but always watchful. Dr. Chen, when she heard about these encounters, was fascinated. "What you're describing is unprecedented," she told Jake. "Wild bears simply don't form lasting attachments to individual humans. This suggests a level of emotional intelligence and memory that we're only beginning to understand." But the most incredible moment was yet to come. Just last spring, Jake was photographing wildflowers in a remote alpine meadow when he heard branches breaking in the forest nearby. He looked up to see Mountain emerging from the tree line, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, staying close to their mother's massive frame, were 2 small cubs. Mountain had brought his family to meet Jake. The mother bear and cubs stayed at the edge of the meadow while Mountain approached Jake alone. Once again, he sat down near Jake, huffed his familiar greeting, and then looked back toward his family as if to say, "These are my cubs. This is the human who saved me." Jake barely breathed as he watched the cubs play in the distance, their mother keeping a watchful eye on both her babies and the strange interspecies friendship happening in her territory. After about 20 minutes, Mountain stood, huffed once more, and led his family back into the forest. But not before the cubs, clearly curious about their father's strange friend, took a few hesitant steps toward Jake before being gently guided away by their parents. Word of Jake and Mountain's extraordinary bond began to spread through the wildlife photography and conservation communities. Jake started receiving invitations to speak at conferences, to share his story with researchers studying animal cognition and emotion. But more importantly, Jake's story began to change how people think about wildlife encounters. Instead of seeing animals as dangerous obstacles to avoid, people began to see them as fellow inhabitants of this planet, deserving of respect, protection, and sometimes help. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a leading researcher in animal cognition at the University of British Columbia, spent months studying Jake and Mountain's interactions through remote trail cameras Jake had set up in the area. "What we're seeing challenges our fundamental understanding of bear psychology," Dr. Walsh explained in her research paper. "Bears have excellent memories, but this level of ongoing social attachment to a human is virtually unheard of in wild populations." Her research suggested that Mountain's near-death experience may have created a form of psychological imprinting, a deep association between Jake and survival that transcended normal species barriers.
It's possible that in Mountain's mind, Jake isn't categorized as human in the traditional sense, Dr. Walsh theorized. He may be categorized as family or pack member, a being who proved trustworthy in the most vulnerable moment of his life. The implications of this research extend far beyond one remarkable friendship. It suggests that wildlife rehabilitation could be enhanced by consistent, gentle human interaction during recovery. It demonstrates that wild animals are capable of complex emotional responses, including gratitude and lasting affection. Jake's story caught the attention of wildlife filmmaker David Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chen, who proposed creating a documentary about the unusual friendship. Initially hesitant to commercialize his relationship with Mountain, Jake eventually agreed when he realized the platform could be used to promote wildlife conservation. The documentary, Mountain's Gift, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and went on to win 3 Emmy Awards. But more importantly, it sparked a global conversation about human-wildlife coexistence. Schools began using Jake's story in their environmental education programs. Conservation organizations saw increases in both volunteer participation and funding. Most remarkably, several other cases of extraordinary human-wildlife bonds began to surface, suggesting that Jake and Mountain's relationship, while rare, wasn't entirely unique. As Jake reflects on his relationship with Mountain, he often talks about what the bear taught him about love, gratitude, and the connections that bind all living things. People ask me if I was crazy to risk my life for a wild bear, Jake says during his conservation speaking engagements. But I think the crazy thing would have been to drive past a suffering creature and do nothing. Mountain didn't see species when he looked at me. He saw someone who cared, and that made all the difference. The story of Jake and Mountain challenges us to reconsider our relationship with the natural world. In a time when human development continues to encroach on wildlife habitats, when climate change threatens countless species, when fear and misunderstanding often drive wildlife policy, their bond offers a different vision. It's a vision where compassion transcends species boundaries, where a moment of kindness can create a lifetime of connection, where the wild things we fear might actually be capable of love, gratitude, and loyalty that rivals our own pets. Today, Jake continues his wildlife photography work in the mountains of British Columbia. Mountain, now estimated to be nearly 10 years old, still makes occasional appearances during Jake's expeditions. The encounters are less frequent, as Mountain's territory has expanded and his family responsibilities have grown, but the recognition remains. Just last month, Jake was setting up for a sunrise shoot when he heard a familiar huff from the tree line. Mountain, now showing some gray around his muzzle, emerged briefly from the forest, acknowledged Jake with their traditional greeting, and disappeared back into the wilderness. He's older now, and he's got his own life to live, but every time he shows up, I'm reminded that kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. Dr. Chen, now in her early 60s and considering retirement, still keeps detailed records of every mountain sighting reported by Jake. Her research data spans nearly 4 years now, creating what she believes is the longest documented case of human-wildlife friendship in scientific literature. Jake gave Mountain a second chance at life, Dr. Chen reflects. But in many ways, Mountain gave Jake something just as valuable: proof that compassion can bridge any gap, even the one between human and wild. The Jake and Mountain story has influenced wildlife policy in British Columbia and beyond. The provincial government implemented new wildlife crossing structures on major highways, reducing vehicle-animal collisions by 60% in the areas where they've been installed. Mountain Story became the inspiration for Jake's Law, legislation requiring drivers who strike large wildlife to report the incident immediately, ensuring that injured animals receive prompt medical attention rather than being left to die. The Whistler Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, now known as the Jake Morrison Wildlife Center in honor of his contributions, has treated and released more than 500 animals since Mountain's recovery. The center has also become a training facility for wildlife rehabilitation specialists from around the world. Perhaps most significantly, Jake's story has inspired a new generation of wildlife photographers, conservationists, and veterinarians who see their work not just as careers, but as callings to bridge the gap between human and natural worlds. As Jake prepares for another summer of photography in the mountains, he carries with him the lessons Mountain taught him about the power of a single act of compassion. His camera bag now includes not just professional photography equipment, but also a wildlife first aid kit and emergency contact information for every rehabilitation center within a 100-mile radius. You never know when you might encounter another mountain, Jake explains. And if that day comes, I want to be ready. The story of Jake Morrison and Mountain the bear reminds us that in a world that can often feel divided and disconnected, the capacity for love, gratitude, and friendship knows no boundaries. It lives in the human heart, in the soul of a wild bear, and in countless small moments when we choose compassion over indifference, action over apathy. Mountain saved Jake just as surely as Jake saved Mountain. He saved him from a life lived behind the lens, always watching but never truly connecting. He saved him from the cynicism that says wild things can't feel gratitude, can't form bonds, can't love. And in saving Jake, Mountain saved countless other animals who have benefited from Jake's advocacy, from the wildlife center his story helped fund, from the policies his experience helped shape, and from the minds his story helped change. Every time Jake shares Mountain's story, whether through his photography, his speaking engagements, or the documentary that continues to air around the world, he creates new ripples of compassion. Teachers share the story with their students. Children ask their parents if they can donate their allowance to wildlife rehabilitation centers. Drivers slow down when they see wildlife crossing signs. Last year, a young girl named Emma from Saskatchewan wrote to Jake after seeing his documentary at school. She had found an injured owl in her backyard and, inspired by Mountain's story, convinced her parents to take it to a local wildlife rehabilitation center. The owl made a full recovery and was released back into the wild. "Your story taught me that every animal deserves a chance," Emma wrote in her letter. "I hope someday I can help animals like you helped Mountain." Emma's letter sits framed on Jake's desk, right next to his favorite photograph of Mountain, the one taken during their last encounter, where the old bear's eyes seem to hold all the wisdom and gratitude of the forest itself. We share this planet with millions of species, each fighting their own battles for survival in a world increasingly shaped by human activity. Sometimes, like Jake, we have the opportunity to make a direct difference in an individual animal's life. But all of us, every day, have the chance to make choices that either help or harm the wild creatures around us. Whether it's supporting wildlife rehabilitation centers, advocating for wildlife-friendly policies, driving more carefully in animal habitats, or simply teaching our children to see animals as fellow inhabitants rather than obstacles or entertainment, we all have the power to create positive ripples. Mountain's gift to Jake was proof that compassion creates connection across any boundary. Jake's gift to Mountain was a second chance at life. Together, their gift to all of us is the reminder that in a world that can feel increasingly divided, love remains the universal language. Their story continues every time someone chooses kindness over indifference, every time someone stops to help rather than passes by, every time someone sees a wild animal not as a threat or curiosity, but as a fellow being deserving of respect and care. Mountain is still out there in the forests of British Columbia, living his wild life, raising his family,
carrying within his memory the knowledge that not all humans are threats, that some, in fact, are capable of extraordinary compassion. And Jake is still there too, camera in hand, documenting the beauty of the wilderness, always ready to set down his equipment if another creature needs help. Forever changed by the bear who taught him that love knows no species. What will your story be? When faced with the choice between helping and walking away, between compassion and indifference, between connection and separation, what will you choose? The animals are watching. The planet is waiting. And somewhere in the mountains, a bear named Mountain continues to prove that love, once given, never truly ends. If this story moved you, please like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible animal stories, and share Mountain's message with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of compassion. Together, we can create a world where every creature gets their second chance. Because in the end, we're all just fellow travelers on this beautiful, wild planet, and we all deserve the chance to experience the miracle of unconditional love.